And she who had been advancing towards the footlights saw him suddenly and came to a halt, making a moan like a child. Indeed, she was very like a child. Though clearly a full-grown woman, only a slight wrinkling of the tender flesh around her eyes betrayed her age. Her breasts, though small, were beautifully shaped beneath her blouse, and her hips, though narrow, gave her long, dusty skirt a sharp, sensual angularity. As she moved back from the vampire, I saw the tears standing in her eyes, like glass in the flicker of the lights, and I felt my spirit contract in fear for her and in longing. Her beauty was heartbreaking. Behind her, a number of painted skulls suddenly moved against the blackness, the figures that carry the masks invisible in their black clothes, except for free white hands that clasped the edge of a cape, the folds of a skirt. Vampire women were there, moving in with the men towards the victim, and now they all, one by one, thrust the masks away, so they fell in an artful pile, the sticks like bones, the skulls grinning into the darkness above, and there they stood, 7 vampires, the women vampires, 3 in number, their molded white breasts shining over the tight black bodices of their gowns, their hard luminescent faces staring with dark eyes beneath curls of black hair. Starkly beautiful as they seemed to float close around that florid human figure, yet pale and cold compared to that sparkling golden hair, that petal-pink skin. I could hear the breath of the audience, the halting, the soft sighs. It was a spectacle, that circle of white faces pressing closer and closer, and that leading figure, that gentleman death, turning to the audience now, with his hands crossed over his heart, his head bent in longing to elicit their sympathy. Was she not irresistible? A murmur of accenting laughter, of sighs. But it was she who broke the magic silence. "I don't want to die," she whispered. Her voice was like a bell. "We are death," he answered her, and from around her came the whisper, "Death." She turned, tossing her hair so it became a veritable shower of gold, a rich and living thing over the dust off her poor clothing. "Help me," she cried out softly, as if afraid even to raise her voice. "Someone," she said to the crowd she knew must be there. A soft laughter came from Claudia. The girl on stage only vaguely understood where she was, what was happening, but knew infinitely more than this house of people that gaped at her. "I don't want to die. I don't want to." Her delicate voice broke, her eyes fixed on the tall, malevolent leader vampire, that demon trickster who now stepped out of the circle of the others towards her. "We all die," he answered her. "The one thing you share with every mortal is death." His hand took in the orchestra, the distant faces of the balcony, the boxes. "No," she protested in disbelief. "I have so many years, so many." Her voice was light, lilting in her pain. It made her irresistible, just as did the movement of her naked throat and the hand that fluttered there. "Years," said the master vampire. "How do you know what you have so many years?" "Death is no respecter of age. There could be a sickness in your body now, already devouring you from within, or outside a man might be waiting to kill you simply for your yellow hair." And his fingers reached for it, the sound of his deep preternatural voice, sonorous. "Need I tell what fate may have in store for you?" "I don't care, I'm not afraid," she protested, her clarion voice so fragile after him. "I would take my chance." "And if you do take that chance and live for years, what would be your heritage? The humpbacked, toothless visage of old age?" And now he lifted her hair behind her back, exposing her pale throat, and slowly he drew the string from the loose gathers of her blouse, the cheap fabric open, the sleeves slipping off her narrow pink shoulders, and she clasped it, only to have him take her wrists and thrust them sharply away. The audience seemed to sigh in a body, the women behind their opera glasses, the men leaning forward in their chairs. I could see the cloth falling, see the pale, flawless skin pulsing with her heart, and the tiny nipples letting the cloth slip precariously, the vampire holding her right wrist tightly at her side, the tears coursing down her blushing cheeks, her teeth biting into the flesh of her lip. "Just as sure as this flesh is pink, it will turn gray, wrinkled with age," he said. "Let me live, please," she begged, her face turning away from him. "I don't care, I don't care." "But then, why should you care if you die now? If these things don't frighten you, these horrors?" She shook her head, baffled, outsmarted, helpless. I felt the anger in my veins, as sure as the passion. With a bowed head, she bore the whole responsibility for defending life. And it was unfair, monstrously unfair, that she should have to pit logic against his for what was obvious and sacred, and so beautifully embodied in her. But he made her speechless, made her overwhelming instincts seem petty, confused. I could feel her dying inside, weakening, and I hated him. The blouse slipped to her waist, a murmur moved through the titillated crowd as her small round breasts stood exposed. She struggled to free her wrist, but he held it fast. And suppose we were to let you go, suppose the grim reaper had a heart that could resist your beauty. To whom would he turn his passion? Someone must die in your place. Would you pick the person for us? The person to stand here and suffer as you suffer now? He gestured to the audience. Her confusion was terrible. Have you a sister, a mother, a child? No, she gasped. No, shaking the mane of hair. Surely someone could take your place, a friend. Choose. I can't. I wouldn't. She writhed in his tight grasp. The vampires around her looked on, still, their faces evincing no emotion, as if the preternatural flesh were masks. Can't you do it? He taunted her, and I knew if she said she could, how he would only condemn her, say she was as evil as he for making someone for death, say that she deserved her fate. Death waits for you everywhere, he sighed now, as if he were suddenly frustrated. The audience could not perceive it. I could see the muscles of his smooth face tightening. He was trying to keep her gray eyes on his eyes, but she looked desperately, hopefully away from him. On the warm, rising air I could smell the dust and perfume of her skin, hear the soft beating of her heart. Unconscious death, the fate of all mortals. He bent closer to her, musing, infatuated with her, but struggling. But we are conscious death. That would make you a bride. Do you know what it means to be loved by death? He all but kissed her face, the brilliant stain of her tears. Do you know what it means to have death know your name? She looked at him, overcome with fear. And then her eyes seemed to mist over, her lips to go slack. She was staring past him at the figure of another vampire, who had emerged slowly from the shadows. For a long time he had stood on the periphery of the gathering, his hands clasped, his large dark eyes very still. His attitude was not the attitude of hunger. He did not appear rapt, but she was looking into his eyes now, and her pain bathed her in a beauteous light, a light which made her irresistibly alluring. It was this that held the jaded audience, this terrible pain. I could feel her skin, feel the small pointed breasts, feel my arms caressing her. I shut my eyes against it and saw her starkly against that private darkness. It was what they felt all around her, this community of vampires. She had no chance. And looking up again, I saw her shimmering in the smoky light of the footlamps, saw her tears like gold as soft from that other vampire who stood at a distance. Came the words, "No pain." I could see the trickster stiffen, but no one else would see it. They would see only the girl's smooth, childlike face, those parted lips, slack with innocent wonder as she gazed at that distant vampire, hear her soft voice repeat after him, "No pain. Your beauty is a gift to us." His rich voice effortlessly filled the house, seemed to fix and subdue the mounting wave of excitement, and slightly, almost imperceptibly, his hand moved. The trickster was receding, becoming one of those patient white faces, whose hunger and equanimity were strangely one. And slowly, gracefully, the other moved towards her. She was languid, her nakedness forgotten, those lids fluttering, a sigh escaping her moist lips. "No pain," she accented. I could hardly bear it, the sight of her yearning towards him. Seeing her dying now under this vampire's power, I wanted to cry out to her, to break her swoon. And I wanted her as he was moving in on her, his hand out now for the drawstring of her skirt, as she inclined towards him, her head back, the black cloth slipping over her hips, over the golden gleam of the hair between her legs. A child's down, that delicate curl, the skirt dropping to her feet. And this vampire opened his arms, his back to the flickering footlights, his auburn hair seeming to tremble as the gold of her hair fell around his black coat. "No pain, no pain," he was whispering to her, and she was giving herself over. And now, turning her slowly to the side, so that they could all see her serene face, he was lifting her, her back arching as her naked breast touched his buttons, her pale arms enfolded his neck. She stiffened, cried out as he sank his teeth, and her face was still as the dark theatre reverberated with shared passion. His white hand shone on her florid buttocks, her hair dusting it, stroking it. He lifted her off the boards as he drank, her throat gleaming against his white cheek. I felt weak, dazed hunger rising in me, knotting my heart, my veins. I felt my hand gripping the brass bar of the box. tighter until I could feel the metal creaking in its joints. And that soft wrenching sound which none of those mortals might hear seemed somehow to hook me to the solid place where I was. I bowed my head. I wanted to shut my eyes. The air seemed fragrant with her salted skin, and close and hot and sweet. Around her the other vampires drew in. The white hand that held her tight quivered, and the auburn-haired vampire let her go, turning her, displaying her head fallen back, as he gave her over one of those starkly beautiful vampire women rising behind her, cradling her, stroking her, as she bent to drink. They were all about her now, as she was passed from one to another and to another. Before the enthralled crowd, her head thrown forward over the shoulder of a vampire man, the nape of her neck as enticing as the small buttocks or the flawless skin of her long thighs. The tender creases behind her limply bent knees. I was sitting back in the chair, my mouth full of the taste of her, my veins in torment, and in the corner of my eyes was that auburn-haired vampire who had conquered her, standing apart as he had been before, his dark eyes seeming to pick me from the darkness, seeming to fix on me over the currents of warm air. One by one the vampires were withdrawing. The painted forest came back, sliding soundlessly into place, until the mortal girl, frail and very white, lay naked in that mysterious wood, nestled in the silk of a black bier as if on the floor of the forest itself. And the music had begun again, eerie and alarming, growing louder as the lights grew dimmer. All the vampires were gone except the trickster who had gathered his scythe from the shadows, and also his handheld mask, and he crouched near the sleeping girl as the light slowly faded, and the music alone had power and force in the enclosing dark. And then that died also. For a moment the entire crowd was utterly still. Then applause began here and there and suddenly united everyone around us. The lights rose in the sconces on the walls, and heads turned to one another, conversation erupting all round. A woman rising in the middle of a row to pull her fox fur sharply from the chair, though no one had yet made way for her. Someone else pushing out quickly to the carpeted aisle, and the whole body was on its feet as if driven to the exits. But then the hum became the comfortable, jaded hum of the sophisticated and perfumed crowd that had filled the lobby and the vault of the theater before. The spell was broken. The doors were flung open on the fragrant rain, the clop of horses' hooves, and voices calling for taxis. Down in the sea of slightly askew chairs, a white glove gleamed on a green silk cushion. I sat watching, listening, one hand shielding my lowered face from anyone and no one, my elbow resting on the rail, the passion in me subsiding, the taste of the girl on my lips. It was as though on the smell of the rain came her perfume still, and in the empty theater I could hear the throb of her beating heart. I sucked in my breath, tasted the rain, and glimpsed Claudia sitting infinitely still, her gloved hands in her lap. There was a bitter taste in my mouth and confusion, and then I saw a lone usher moving on the aisle below, riding the stairs, reaching for the scattered programs that littered the carpet. I was aware that this ache in me, this confusion, this blinding passion which only let me go with a stubborn slowness, would be obliterated if I were to drop down to one of those curtained archways beside him, and draw him up fast in the darkness, and take him as that girl was taken. I wanted to do it, and I wanted nothing. Claudia said near my bowed ear, "Patience, Louis, patience." I opened my eyes. Someone was near, on the periphery of my vision, someone who had outsmarted my hearing, my keen anticipation, which penetrated like a sharp antenna even this distraction, or so I thought. But there he was, soundless, beyond the curtained entrance of the box, that vampire with the auburn hair, that detached one, standing on the carpeted stairway looking at us. I knew him now to be, as I had suspected, the vampire who had given me the card admitting us to the theater, Armand. He would have startled me except for his stillness, the remote dreamy quality of his expression. It seemed he'd been standing against that wall for the longest time, and betrayed no sign of change as we looked at him, then came towards him. Had he not so completely absorbed me, I would have been relieved he was not the tall, black-haired one. But I didn't think of this. Now his eyes moved languidly over Claudia with no tribute whatsoever to the human habit of disguising the stare. I placed my hand on Claudia's shoulder. "We've been searching for you a very long time," I said to him, my heart growing calmer as if his calm were drawing off my trepidation, my care, like the sea drawing something into itself from the land. I cannot exaggerate this quality in him, yet I can't describe it and couldn't then. and the fact that my mind sought to describe it even to myself unsettled me. He gave me the very feeling that he knew what I was doing, and his still posture and his deep brown eyes seemed to say there was no use in what I was thinking, or particularly the words I was struggling to form now. Claudia said nothing. He moved away from the wall and began to walk down the stairs, while at the same time he made a gesture that welcomed us and bade us follow. But all this was fluid and fast. My gestures were the caricature of human gestures compared to his. He opened a door in the lower wall and admitted us to the rooms below the theater, his feet only brushing the stone stairway as we descended, his back to us with complete trust. And now we entered what appeared to be a vast subterranean ballroom, carved, as it were, out of a cellar more ancient than the building overhead. Above us, the door that he had opened fell shut, and the light died away before I could get a fair impression of the room. I heard the rustle of his garments in the dark, and then the sharp explosion of a match. His face appeared like a great flame over the match, and then a figure moved into the light beside him, a young boy who brought him a candle. The sight of the boy brought back to me in a shock the teasing pleasure of the naked woman on the stage, her prone body, the pulsing blood, and he turned and gazed at me now, much in the manner of the auburn-haired vampire who had lit the candle and whispered to him, "Go." The light expanded to the distant walls, and the vampire held the light up, moved along the wall, beckoning us to both follow him. I could see a world of frescoes and murals surrounded us, their colors deep and vibrant above the dancing flame, and gradually the theme and content beside us came clear. It was the terrible triumph of death by Bruegel, painted on such a massive scale that all the multitude of ghastly figures towered over us in the gloom, those ruthless skeletons ferrying the helpless dead in a fetid moat, or pulling a cart of human skulls, beheading an outstretched corpse or hanging humans from the gallows. A bell tolled over the endless hell of scorched and smoking land towards which great armies of men came with the hideous mindless march of soldiers to a massacre. I turned away, but the auburn-haired one touched my hand and led me further along the wall to see the fall of the angels slowly materializing with the damned being, driven from the celestial heights into a lurid chaos of feasting monsters. So vivid, so perfect was it, I shuddered. The hand that had touched me did the same again, and I stood still despite it, deliberately looking above to the very height of the mural, where I could make out of the shadows two beautiful angels with trumpets to their lips. And for a second the spell was broken. I had the strong sense of the first evening I had entered Notre Dame, but then that was gone, like something gossamer and precious, snatched away from me. The candle rose and horrors rose all around me. The dumbly passive and degraded damned of Botch, the blotted coned corpses of Trainee, the monstrous horsemen of Dürer, and blown out of all endurable scale a promenade of medieval woodcut, emblem, and engraving, the very ceiling writhed with skeletons and mouldering dead, with demons and the instruments of pain, as if this were the cathedral of death itself. Where we stood finally in the center of the room, the candle seemed to pull the images to life everywhere around us. Delirium threatened, that awful shifting of the room began, that sense of falling. I reached out for Claudia's hand. She stood musing, her face passive, her eyes distant, when I looked to her, as if she'd have me, let her alone, and then her feet shot off from me, with a rapid tapping on the stone floor, that echoed all along the walls, like fingers tapping on my temples, on my skull. I held my temples, staring dumbly at the floor in search of shelter, as if to lift my eyes would force me to look on some wretched suffering I could not endure. Then again I saw the vampire's face floating in his flame, his ageless eyes circled in dark lashes. His lips were very still, but as I stared at him, he seemed to smile, without making even the slightest movement. I watched him all the harder, convinced it was some powerful illusion I could penetrate with keen attention, and the more I watched, the more he seemed to smile, and finally to be animated with a soundless whispering, musing, singing. I could hear it like something curling in the dark, as wallpaper curls in the blast of a fire, or paint peels from the face of a burning doll. I had the urge to reach for him, to shake him violently so that his still face would move, admit to this soft singing, and suddenly I found him pressed against me, his arm around my chest. His lashes so close I could see them matted and gleaming above the incandescent orb of his eye, his soft, tasteless breath against my skin. It was delirium. I moved to get away from him, and yet I was drawn to him, and I didn't move at all, his arm exerting its firm pressure, his candle blazing now against my eye so that I felt the warmth of it. All my cold flesh yearned for that warmth, but suddenly I waved to snuff it but couldn't find it. And all I saw was his radiant face, as I had never seen Lestat's face, white and poreless and sinewy and male. The other vampire, all other vampires, an infinite procession of my own kind. The moment ended. I found myself with my hand outstretched, touching his face, but he was a distance away from me, as if he'd never moved near me, making no attempt to brush my hand away. I drew back, flushed, stunned. Far away in the Paris night a bell chimed, the dull golden circles of sound seeming to penetrate the walls, the timbers that carried that sound down into the earth like great organ pipes. Again came that whispering, that inarticulate singing, and through the gloom I saw that mortal boy watching me, and I smelled the hot aroma of his flesh. The vampire's facile hand beckoned him, and he came towards me, his eyes fearless and exciting, and he drew up to me in the candlelight and put his arms around my shoulders. Never had I felt this, never had I experienced it, this yielding of a conscious mortal. But before I could push him away for his own sake, I saw the bluish bruise on his tender neck. He was offering it to me. He was pressing the length of his body against me now, and I felt the hard strength of his sex beneath his clothes pressing against my leg. A wretched gasp escaped my lips, but he bent close, his lips on what must have been so cold, so lifeless for him, and I sank my teeth into his skin, my body rigid, that hard sex driving against me, and I lifted him in passion off the floor. Wave after wave of his beating heart passed into me as weightless. I rocked with him, devouring him, his ecstasy, his conscious pleasure. Then, weak and gasping, I saw him at a distance from me, my arms empty, my mouth still, flooded with the taste of his blood. He lay against that auburn-haired vampire, his arm about the vampire's waist, and he gazed at me in that same pacific manner of the vampire, his eyes misted over and weak from the loss of life. I remember moving mutely forward, drawn to him and seemingly unable to control it, that gaze taunting me, that conscious life defying me. He should die, would not die, he would live on, comprehending, surviving that intimacy. I turned. The host of vampires moved in the shadows, their candles whipped and fleeting on the cool air, and above them loomed a great broadcast of ink-drawn figures, the sleeping corpse of a woman ravaged by a vulture with a human face, a naked man bound hand and foot to a tree beside him, hanging the torso of another, his severed arms tied still to another branch, and on a spike this dead man's staring head. The singing came again, that thin ethereal singing. Slowly the hunger in me subsided, obeyed, but my head throbbed, and the flames of the candles seemed to merge in burnished circles of light. Someone touched me suddenly, pushed me roughly, so that I almost lost my balance, and when I straightened I saw the thin, angular face of the trickster vampire I despised. He reached out for me with his white hands, but the other one, the distant one, moved forward suddenly and stood between us. It seemed he struck the other vampire that I saw him move, and then again I did not see him move. Both stood still like statues, eyes fixed on one another, and time passed like wave after wave of water rolling back from a still beach. I cannot say how long we stood there, the three of us in those shadows, and how utterly still they seemed to me, only the shimmering flames seeming to have life behind them. Then I remember floundering along the wall and finding a large oak chair into which I all but collapsed. It seemed Claudia was near and speaking to someone in a hushed but sweet voice. My forehead teemed with blood, with heat. "Come with me," said the auburn-haired vampire. I was searching his face for the movement of his lips that must have preceded the sound, yet it was so hopelessly long after the sound. And then we were walking, the three of us, down a long stone stairway, deeper beneath the city. Claudia ahead of us, her shadow long against the wall. The air grew cool and refreshing with the fragrance of water, and I could see the droplets bleeding through the stones like beads of gold in the light of the vampire's candle. It was a small chamber we entered, a fire burning in a deep fireplace, cut into the stone wall. A bed lay at the other end, fitted into the rock and enclosed with two brass gates. At first I saw these things clearly, and saw the long wall of books opposite, the fireplace and the wooden desk that was against it, and the coffin to the other side. But then the room began to waver, and the auburn-haired vampire put his hands on my shoulders and guided me down into a leather chair. The fire was intensely hot against my legs, but this felt good to me, sharp and clear, something to draw me out of this confusion. I sat back, my eyes only half open, and tried to see again what was about me. It was as if that distant bed were a stage, and on the linen pillows of the little stage lay that boy, his black hair parted in the middle and curling about his ears, so that he looked now in his dreamy fevered state like one of those lithe androgynous creatures of a Botticelli painting. And beside him, nestled against him, her tiny white hand stark against his ruddy flesh, lay Claudia, her face buried in his neck. The masterful auburn-haired vampire looked on, his hands clasped in front of him. And when Claudia rose now, the boy shuddered. The vampire picked her up gently, as I might pick her up, her hands finding a hold on his neck, her eyes half shut with the swoon, her lips rouged with blood, and he set her gently on the desk as she lay back against the leather-bound books, her hands falling gracefully into the lap of her lavender dress. The gates closed on the boy, and burying his face in the pillows, he slept. There was something disturbing to me in the room, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't in truth know what was wrong with me, only that I'd been drawn forcefully, either by myself or someone else, from two fierce consuming states, an absorption with those grim paintings, and the kill to which I'd abandoned myself obscenely in the eyes of others. I didn't know what it was that threatened me now, what it was that my mind sought to escape from. I kept looking at Claudia, the way she lay against the books, the way she sat amongst the objects of the desk, the polished white skull, the candle holder, the open parchment book whose hand-painted script gleamed in the light, and then above her there emerged into focus the lacquered and shimmering painting of a medieval devil, horned and hooved, his bestial figure looming over a coven of worshipping witches. Her head was just beneath it, the loose curling strands of her hair just stroking it, and she watched the brown-eyed vampire with wide, wondering eyes. I wanted to pick her up suddenly and frightfully, horribly. I saw her in my kindled imagination, flopping like a doll. I was gazing at the devil, that monstrous face preferable to the sight of her, in her eerie stillness. "You won't awaken the boy if you speak," said the brown-eyed vampire. "You've come from so far, you've traveled so long." And gradually my confusion subsided, as if smoke were rising and moving away on a current of fresh air, and I lay awake and very calm, looking at him as he sat in the opposite chair. Claudia, too, looked at him, and he looked from one to the other of us, his smooth face and pacific eyes very like they'd been all along, as though there had never been any change in him at all. "My name is Armand," he said. "I sent Santiago to give you the invitation. I know your names. I welcome you to my house." I gathered my strength to speak, my voice sounding strange to me when I told him that we had feared we were alone. "But how did you come into existence?" he asked. Claudia's hand rose ever so slightly from her lap, her eyes moving mechanically from his face to mine. I saw this and knew that he must have seen it, and yet he gave no sign. I knew at once what she meant to tell me. "You don't want to answer," said Armand, his voice low and even more measured than Claudia's voice, far less human than my own. I sensed myself slipping away again into contemplation of that voice and those eyes, from which I had to draw myself up with great effort. "Are you the leader of this group?" I asked him. "Not in the way you mean, leader," he answered, "but if there were a leader here, I would be that one. I haven't come, you'll forgive me, to talk of how I came into being, because that's no mystery to me. It presents no question. So if you have no power to which I might be required to render respect, I don't wish to talk of those things. If I told you I did have such power, would you respect it?" he asked. I wish I could describe his manner of speaking, how each time he spoke he seemed to arise out of a state of contemplation, very like that state into which I felt I was drifting, from which it took so much to wrench myself, and yet he never moved and seemed at all times alert. This distracted me, while at the same time I was powerfully attracted by it, as I was by this room, its simplicity, its rich, warm combination of essentials, the books, the desk, the two chairs by the fire, the coffin, the pictures. The luxury of those rooms in the hotel seemed vulgar, but more than that, meaningless beside this room. I understood all of it except for the mortal boy, the sleeping boy, whom I didn't understand at all. "I'm not certain," I said, unable to keep my eyes off that awful medieval Satan. "I would have to know from whom it comes, whether it came from other vampires or elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" he said. "What is elsewhere?" "That." I pointed to the medieval picture. "That is a picture," he said. "Nothing more?" "Nothing more." Then Satan, some satanic power, doesn't give you your power here, either as leader or as vampire? No, he said calmly. So calmly it was impossible for me to know what he thought of my questions, if he thought of them at all in the manner which I knew to be thinking. And the other vampires? No, he said. Then we are not, I sat forward, the children of Satan? How could we be the children of Satan? He asked. Do you believe that Satan made this world around you? No, I believe that God made it, if anyone made it, but he must also have made Satan, and I want to know if we are his children. Exactly. And consequently, if you believe God made Satan, you must realize that all Satan's power comes from God, and that Satan is simply God's child, and that we are God's children also. There are no children of Satan, really. I couldn't disguise my feelings at this. I sat back against the leather, looking at that small woodcut of the devil, released for the moment from any sense of obligation to Armand's presence, lost in my thoughts, in the undeniable implications of his simple logic. But why does this concern you? Surely what I say doesn't surprise you, he said. Why do you let it affect you? Let me explain, I began. I know that you're a master vampire. I respect you, but I'm incapable of your detachment. I know what it is, and I do not possess it, and I doubt that I ever will. I accept this. I understand, he nodded. I saw you in the theater. Your suffering, your sympathy with that girl. I saw your sympathy for Denis when I offered him to you. You die when you kill, as if you feel that you deserve to die, and you stint on nothing. But why, with this passion and this sense of justice, do you wish to call yourself the child of Satan? I'm evil, evil as any vampire who ever lived. I've killed over and will do it again. I took that boy Denis when you gave him to me, though I was incapable of knowing whether he would survive or not. Why does that make you as evil as any vampire? Aren't there gradations of evil? Is evil a great perilous gulf into which one falls with the first sin, plummeting to the depth? Yes, I think it is, I said to him. It's not logical as you would make it sound, but it's that dark, that empty, and it is without consolation. But you're not being fair, he said with the first glimmer of expression in his voice. Surely you attribute great degrees and variations to goodness. There is the goodness of the child, which is innocence, and then there is the goodness of the monk who has given up everything to others and lives a life of self-deprivation and service. The goodness of saints, the goodness of good housewives. Are all these the same? No, but equally and infinitely different from evil, I answered. I didn't know I thought these things. I spoke them now as my thoughts, and they were my most profound feelings, taking a shape they could never have taken had I not spoken them, had I not thought them out this way in conversation with another. I thought myself then possessed of a passive mind, in a sense. I mean that my mind could only pull itself together, formulate thought out of the muddle of longing and pain when it was touched by another mind, fertilized by, deeply excited by that other mind, and driven to form conclusions. I felt now the rarest, most acute alleviation of loneliness. I could easily visualize and suffer that moment years before in another century when I had stood at the foot of Babette's stairway and feel the perpetual metallic frustration of years with Lestat, and then that passionate and doomed affection for Claudia which made loneliness retreat behind the soft indulgence of the senses, the same senses that longed for the kill. And I saw the desolate mountaintop in Eastern Europe where I had confronted that mindless vampire and killed him in the monastery ruins. And it was as if the great feminine longing of my mind were being awakened again to be satisfied. And this I felt despite my own words, but it's that dark, that empty, and it is without consolation. I looked at Armand, at his large brown eyes and that taut, timeless face watching me again, like a painting, and I felt the slow shifting of the physical world I'd felt in the painted ballroom, the pull of my old delirium, the wakening of a need so terrible that the very promise of its fulfillment contained the unbearable possibility of disappointment. And yet there was the question, the awful ancient hounding question of evil. I think I put my hands to my head as mortals do when so deeply troubled that they instinctively cover the face, reach for the brain, as if they could reach through the skull and massage the living organ out of its agony. And how is this evil achieved, he asked. How does one fall from grace and become in one instant as evil as the mob tribunal of the Revolution or the most cruel of the Roman emperors? Does one merely have to miss Mass on Sunday? Or bite down on the communion host? Or steal a loaf of bread? Or sleep with a neighbor's wife? No, I shook my head. No. But if evil is without gradation and it does exist, this state of evil, then only one sin is needed. Isn't that what you are saying? That God exists and... I don't know if God exists, I said, and for all I do know, he doesn't exist. Then no sin matters, he said. No sin achieves evil. That's not true, because if God doesn't exist, we are the creatures of highest consciousness in the universe. We alone understand the passage of time and the value of every minute of human life. And what constitutes evil, real evil, is the taking of a single human life. Whether a man would have died tomorrow, or the day after, or eventually, it doesn't matter. Because if God does not exist, this life, every second of it, is all we have. He sat back as if for the moment stopped, his large eyes narrowing, then fixing on the depths of the fire. This was the first time since he had come for me that he had looked away from me, and I found myself looking at him unwatched. For a long time he sat in this manner, and I could all but feel his thoughts, as if they were palpable in the air like smoke. Not read them, you understand, but feel the power of them. It seemed he possessed an aura, and even though his face was very young, which I knew meant nothing, he appeared infinitely old, wise. I could not define it, because I could not explain how the youthful lines of his face, how his eyes expressed innocence and this age and experience at the same time. He rose now and looked at Claudia, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. Her silence all this time had been understandable to me. These were not her questions, yet she was fascinated with him, and was waiting for him, and no doubt learning from him all the while that he spoke to me. But I understood something else now as they looked at each other. He had moved to his feet with a body totally at his command, devoid of the habit of human gesture. Gesture rooted in necessity, ritual, fluctuation of mind, and his stillness now was unearthly, and she, as I'd never seen before, possessed the same stillness, and they were gazing at each other with a preternatural understanding, from which I was simply excluded. I was something whirling and vibrating to them as mortals were to me, and I knew when he turned towards me again that he'd come to understand. She did not believe or share my concept of evil. His speech commenced without the slightest warning. "This is the only real evil left," he said to the flames. "Yes," I answered, feeling that all-consuming subject alive again, obliterating all concerns, as it always had for me. "It's true," he said, shocking me, deepening my sadness, my despair. "Then God does not exist? You have no knowledge of his existence?" "None," he said. "No knowledge?" I said it again, unafraid of my simplicity, my miserable human pain. "None. And no vampire here has discourse with God or with the devil?" "No vampire that I've ever known," he said, musing, the fire dancing in his eyes. "And as far as I know today, after 400 years, I am the oldest living vampire in the world." I stared at him, astonished. Then it began to sink in. It was as I'd always feared, and it was as lonely. It was as totally without hope. Things would go on as they had before, on and on. My search was over. I sat back listlessly, watching those licking flames. It was futile to leave him to continue it, futile to travel the world, only to hear again the same story. 400 years, I think I repeated the words, 400 years. I remember staring at the fire. There was a log falling very slowly in the fire, drifting downwards in a process that would take it the night. And it was pitted with tiny holes where some substance that had larded it through and through had burned away fast. And in each of these tiny holes there danced a flame amid the larger flames. And all of these tiny flames with their black mouths seemed to me faces that made a chorus. And the chorus sang without singing. The chorus had no need of singing. In one breath in the fire, which was continuous, it made its soundless song. All at once Armand moved in a loud rustling of garments, a descent of crackling shadow and light that left him kneeling at my feet, his hands outstretched, holding my head, his eyes burning. This evil, this concept, it comes from disappointment, from bitterness, don't you see? Children of Satan, children of God. Is this the only question you bring to me? Is this the only power that obsesses you, so that you must make us gods and devils yourself, when the only power that exists is inside ourselves? How could you believe in these old fantastical lies, these myths, these emblems of the supernatural? He snatched the devil from above Claudia's still countenance, so swiftly that I couldn't see the gesture, only the demon leering before me and then crackling in the flames. Something was broken inside me when he said this, something ripped aside so that a torrent of feeling became one with my muscles in every limb. I was on my feet now, backing away from him. "Are you mad?" I asked, astonished at my own anger, my own despair. "We stand here, the two of us, immortal, ageless, rising nightly to feed that immortality on human blood, and there, on your desk, against the knowledge of the ages, sits a flawless child as demonic as ourselves. And you ask me how I could believe I would find a meaning in the supernatural? I tell you, after seeing what I have become, I could damn well believe anything. Couldn't you? And believing thus, being thus confounded, I can now accept the most fantastical truth of all, that there is no meaning to any of this." I backed towards the door, away from his astonished face, his hand hovering before his lips, the finger curling to dig into his palm. "Don't! Come back!" he whispered. "No, not now. Let me go, just a while. Let me go. Nothing's changed. It's all the same. Let that sink into me. Just let me go." I looked back before I shut the door. Claudia's face was turned towards me, though she sat as before, her hands clasped on her knee. She made a gesture then, subtle as her smile, which was tinged with the faintest sadness that I was to go on. It was my desire to escape the theatre then entirely, to find the streets of Paris and wander, letting the vast accumulation of shocks gradually wear away. But as I groped along the stone passage of the lower cellar, I became confused. I was perhaps incapable of exerting my own will. It seemed more than ever absurd to me that Lestat should have died, if in fact he had, and looking back on him, as it seemed I was always doing, I saw him more kindly than before. Lost, like the rest of us, not the jealous protector of any knowledge he was afraid to share. He knew nothing, there was nothing to know. Only that was not quite the thought that was gradually coming clear to me. I had hated him for all the wrong reasons. Yes, that was true. But I did not fully understand it yet. Confounded, I found myself sitting finally on those dark steps, the light from the ballroom throwing my own shadow on the rough floor, my hands holding my head, a weariness overcoming me. My mind said sleep, but more profoundly my mind said dream. And yet I made no move to return to the Hotel St. Gabriel, which seemed a very secure and airy place to me now, a place of subtle and luxurious mortal consolation where I might lie in a chair of puce velvet, put one foot on an ottoman, and watch the fire lick the marble tile, looking for all the world to myself in the long mirrors, like a thoughtful human. Flee to that, I thought, flee all that is pulling you. And again came that thought. I have wronged Lestat. I have hated him for all the wrong reasons. I whispered it now, trying to withdraw it from the dark, inarticulate pool of my mind, and the whispering made a scratching sound in the stone vault of the stairs. But then a voice came softly to me on the air, too faint for mortals. "How is this so? How did you wrong him?" I turned round so sharp that my breath left me. A vampire sat near me, so near as to almost brush my shoulder with the tip of his boot, his legs drawn up close to him, his hands clasped around them. For a moment I thought my eyes deceived me. It was the trickster vampire, whom Armand had called Santiago. Yet nothing in his manner indicated his former self, that devilish, hateful self that I had seen even only a few hours ago when he had reached out for me, and Armand had struck him. He was staring at me over his drawn-up knees, his hair disheveled, his mouth slack and without cunning. "It makes no difference to anyone else," I said to him, the fear in me subsiding. "But you said a name. I heard you say a name," he said. "A name I don't want to say again," I answered, looking away from him. I could see now how he'd fooled me, why his shadow had not fallen over mine. He crouched in my shadow. The vision of him slithering down those stone stairs to sit behind me was slightly disturbing. Everything about him was disturbing, and I reminded myself that he could in no way be trusted. It seemed to me then that Armand, with his hypnotic power, aimed in some way for the maximum truth and presentation of himself. He had drawn out of me without words my state of mind. But this vampire was a liar, and I could feel his power, a crude, pounding power that was almost as strong as Armand. "You come to Paris in search of us, and then you sit alone on the stairs," he said in a conciliatory tone. "Why don't you come up with us? Why don't you speak to us and talk to us of this person whose name you spoke? I know who it was. I know the name." "You don't know. You couldn't know. It was a mortal," I said now, more from instinct than conviction. The thought of Lestat disturbed me, the thought that this creature should know of Lestat's death. "You came here to ponder mortals, justice done to mortals?" he asked, but there was no reproach or mockery in his tone. "I came to be alone. Let me not offend you. It's a fact," I murmured. "But alone in this frame of mind, when you don't even hear my steps? I like you. I want you to come upstairs." And as he said this, he slowly pulled me to my feet beside him. At that moment, the door of Armand's cell threw a long light into the passage. I heard him coming, and Santiago let me go. I was standing there baffled. Armand appeared at the foot of the steps with Claudia in his arms. She had that same dull expression on her face which she'd had all during my talk with Armand. It was as if she were deep in her own considerations and saw nothing around her, and I remember noting this, though not knowing what to think of it, that it persisted even now. I took her quickly from Armand and felt her soft limbs against me as if we were both in the coffin, yielding to that paralytic sleep. And then, with a powerful thrust of his arm, Armand pushed Santiago away. It seemed he fell backwards, but was up again only to have Armand pull him towards the head of the steps. All of this happening so swiftly I could only see the blur of their garments and hear the scratching of their boots. Then Armand stood alone at the head of the steps, and I went upward towards him. "You cannot safely leave the theatre tonight," he whispered to me. "He is suspicious of you, and my having brought you here, he feels that it is his right to know you better. Our security depends on it." He guided me slowly into the ballroom, but then he turned to me and pressed his lips almost to my ear. "I must warn you. Answer no questions. Ask, and you open one bud of truth for yourself after another, but give nothing. Nothing especially concerning your origin." He moved away from us now, but beckoning for us to follow into the gloom where the others were gathered, clustered like remote marble statues, their faces and hands all too like our own. I had the strong sense then of how we were all made from the same material, a thought which had only occurred to me occasionally in all the long years in New Orleans, and it disturbed me, particularly when I saw one or more of the others reflected in the long mirrors that broke the density of those awful murals. Claudia seemed to awaken as I found one of the carved oak chairs and settled into it. She leaned towards me and said something strangely incoherent, which seemed to mean that I must do as Armand said. Say nothing of our origin. I wanted to talk with her now, but I could see that tall vampire Santiago watching us, his eyes moving slowly from us to Armand. Several women vampires had gathered around Armand, and I felt a tumult of feeling as I saw them put their arms around his waist. And what appalled me as I watched was not their exquisite form, their delicate features, and graceful hands made hard as glass by vampire nature, or their bewitching eyes which fixed on me now in a sudden silence. What appalled me was my own fierce jealousy. I was afraid when I saw them so close to him, afraid when he turned and kissed them each, and as he brought them near to me now, I was unsure and confused. Estelle and Celeste are the names I remember. Porcelain beauties who fondled Claudia with the license of the blind, running their hands over her radiant hair, touching even her lips, while she, her eyes still misty and distant, tolerated it all, knowing what I also knew, and what they seemed unable to grasp, that a woman's mind as sharp and distinct as their own lived within that small body. It made me wonder as I watched her turning about for them, holding out her lavender skirts and smiling coldly at their adoration. How many times I must have forgotten, spoken to her as if she were the child, fondled her too freely, brought her into my arms with an adult's abandon. My mind went in three directions: that last night in the Hotel St. Gabriel, which seemed a year ago, when she talked of love with rancor, my reverberating shock at Armand's revelations, or lack of them, and a quiet absorption of the vampires around me, who whispered in the dark beneath the grotesque murals, for I could learn much from the vampires without ever asking a question. And vampire life in Paris was all that I'd feared it to be, all that the little stage in the theatre above had indicated it was. The dim lights of the house were mandatory, and the paintings appreciated in full, added to almost nightly, when some vampires brought a new engraving or picture by a contemporary artist into the house. Celeste, with her cold hand on my arm, spoke with contempt of men as the originators of these pictures, and Estelle, who now held Claudia on her lap, emphasized to me the naive colonial that vampires had not made such horrors themselves but merely collected them, confirming over and over that men were capable of far greater evil than vampires. There was evil in making such paintings? Claudia asked softly in her toneless voice. Celeste threw back her black curls and laughed. What can be imagined can be done, she answered quickly, but her eyes reflected a certain contained hostility. Of course, we strive to rival men in kills of all kinds, do we not? She leaned forward and touched Claudia's knee, but Claudia merely looked at her, watching her laugh nervously and continue. Santiago drew near to bring up the subject of our rooms in the Hotel St. Gabriel. Frightfully unsafe, he said, with an exaggerated stage gesture of the hands, and he showed a knowledge of those rooms which was amazing. He knew the chest in which we slept. It struck him as vulgar. Come here, he said to me, with that near childlike simplicity he had evinced on the steps. Live with us, and such disguise is unnecessary. We have our guards, and tell me, where do you come from, he said, dropping to his knees, his hand on the arm of my chair. Your voice, I know that accent. Speak again. I was vaguely horrified at the thought of having an accent to my French, but this wasn't my immediate concern. He was strong-willed and blatantly possessive, throwing back at me an image of that possessiveness which was flowering in me more fully every moment. And meanwhile the vampires around us talked on, Estelle explaining that black was the color for a vampire's clothes, that Claudia's lovely pastel dress was beautiful but tasteless. We blend with the night, she said. We have a funereal gleam. And now, bending her cheek next to Claudia's cheek, she laughed to soften her criticism. And Celeste laughed, and Santiago laughed, and the whole room seemed alive, with unearthly tinkling laughter, preternatural voices, echoing against the painted walls, rippling the feeble candle flames. Ah, but to cover up such curls, said Celeste, now playing with Claudia's golden hair, and I realized what must have been obvious, that all of them had dyed their hair black. But for Armand, and it was that, along with the black clothes, that added to the disturbing impression that we were statues, from the same chisel and paintbrush. I cannot emphasize too much how disturbed I was by that impression. It seemed to stir something in me, deep inside, something I couldn't fully grasp. I found myself wandering away from them to one of the narrow mirrors, and watching them all over my shoulder. Claudia gleamed like a jewel in their midst, so would that mortal boy who slept below. The realization was coming to me that I found them dull in some awful way. Dull everywhere that I looked, their sparkling vampire eyes repetitious, their wit like a dull brass bell. Only the knowledge I needed distracted me from these thoughts, the vampires of Eastern Europe. Claudia was saying, monstrous creatures, what have they to do with us? Revenants, Armand answered softly over the distance that separated them, playing on faultless preternatural ears to hear what was more muted than a whisper. The room fell silent. Their blood is different, vile. They increase as we do, but without skill or care. In the old days, abruptly he stopped. I could see his face in the mirror. It was strangely rigid. Oh, but tell us about the old days, said Celeste, her voice shrill at human pitch. There was something vicious in her tone. And now Santiago took up the same baiting manner. Yes, tell us of the covens and the herbs that would render us invisible. He smiled. And the burnings at the stake. Armand fixed his eyes on Claudia. Beware those monsters, he said, and calculatedly his eyes passed over Santiago and then Celeste. Those revenants, they will attack you as if you were human. Celeste shuddered, uttering something in contempt, an aristocrat speaking of vulgar cousins who bear the same name. But I was watching Claudia because it seemed her eyes were misted, again as before. She looked away from Armand suddenly. The voices of the others rose again, affected party voices, as they conferred with one another on the night's kills. Describing this or that encounter without a smattering of emotion, challenges to cruelty erupting from time to time like flashes of white lightning. A tall, thin vampire being accosted in one corner for a needless romanticizing of mortal life, a lack of spirit, a refusal to do the most entertaining thing at the moment it was available to him. He was simple, shrugging, slow at words, and would fall for long periods into a stupefied silence, as if near choked with blood, he would as soon have gone to his coffin as remained here. And yet he remained, held by the pressure of this unnatural group, who had made of immortality a conformists' club. How would Lestat have found it? Had he been here? What had caused him to leave? No one had dictated to Lestat he was master of his small circle, but how they would have praised his inventiveness, his cat-like toying with his victims, and waste, that word, that value which had been all important to me as a fledgling vampire, was spoken of often. You wasted the opportunity to kill this child. You wasted the opportunity to frighten this poor woman or drive that man to madness, which only a little prestidigitation would have accomplished. My head was spinning, a common mortal headache. I longed to get away from these vampires, and only the distant figure of Armand held me despite his warnings. He seemed remote from the others now, though he nodded often enough and uttered a few words here and there, so that he seemed a part of them, his hand only occasionally rising from the lion's paw of his chair. And my heart expanded when I saw him this way, saw that no one amongst the small throng caught his glance as I caught his glance, and no one held it from time to time as I held it. Yet he remained aloof from me, his eyes alone returning to me. His warning echoed in my ears, yet I disregarded it. I longed to get away from the theatre altogether, and stood listlessly, garnering information at last that was useless and infinitely dull. "But is there no crime amongst you, no cardinal crime?" Claudia asked. Her violet eyes seemed fixed on me, even in the mirror, as I stood with my back to her. "Crime? Boredom?" cried out Estelle, and she pointed a white finger at Armand. He laughed softly with her from his distant position at the end of the room. "Boredom is death," she cried, and bared her vampire fangs, so that Armand put a languid hand to his forehead in a stage gesture of fear and falling. But Santiago, who was watching with his hands behind his back, intervened. "Crime," he said. "Yes, there is a crime for which we would hunt another vampire down until we destroyed him. Can you guess what that is?" He glanced from Claudia to me and back again to her mask-like face. "You should know, who are so secretive about the vampire that made you." "And why is that?" she asked, her eyes widening ever so slightly, her hands resting still in her lap. A hush fell over the room, gradually then completely. All those white faces turned to face Santiago, as he stood there, 1 foot forward, his hands clasped behind his back, towering over Claudia. His eyes gleamed as he saw he had the floor, and then he broke away and crept up behind me, putting his hand on my shoulder. "Can you guess what that crime is? Didn't your master vampire tell you?" And drawing me slowly around with those invading familiar hands, he tapped my heart lightly in time with its quickening pace. "It is the crime that means death to any vampire anywhere who commits it. It is to kill your own kind." "Ah!" Claudia cried out, and lapsed into peals of laughter. She was walking across the floor now with swirling lavender, silk and crisp, resounding steps. Taking my hand, she said, "I was so afraid it was to be born, like Venus out of the foam as we were. Master Vampire, come, Louis, let's go," she beckoned as she pulled me away. Armand was laughing. Santiago was still, and it was Armand who rose when we reached the door. "You're welcome tomorrow night," he said, "and the night after." I don't think I caught my breath until I'd reached the street. The rain was still falling, and all of the street seemed sodden and desolate in the rain, but beautiful. A few scattered bits of paper blowing in the wind, a gleaming carriage passing slowly with the thick rhythmic clop of the horse. The sky was pale violet. I sped fast, with Claudia beside me, leading the way. Then finally, frustrated with the length of my stride, riding in my arms. "I don't like them," she said to me with a steel fury as we neared the Hotel St. Gabriel. Even its immense brightly lit lobby was still in the pre-dawn hour. I spirited past the sleepy clerks, the long faces at the desk. "I've searched for them the world over, and I despise them." She threw off her cape and walked into the center of the room. A volley of rain hit the French windows. I found myself turning up the lights one by one and lifting the candelabrum to the gas flames as if I were Lestat or Claudia. And then, seeking the puce velvet chair I'd envisioned in that cellar, I slipped down into it, exhausted. It seemed for the moment as if the room blazed about me, as my eyes fixed on a gilt-frame painting of pastel trees and serene waters. The vampire spell was broken. They couldn't touch us here, and yet I knew this to be a lie, a foolish lie. "I am in danger, danger," Claudia said with that smoldering wrath. "But how can they know what we did to him? Besides, we are in danger. Do you think for a moment I don't acknowledge my own guilt, and if you were the only one?" I reached out for her now as she drew near, but her fierce eyes settled on me and I let my hands drop back limp. "Do you think I would leave you in danger?" She was smiling. For a moment I didn't believe my eyes. "No, you would not, Louis, you would not. Danger holds you to me." "Love holds me to you," I said softly. "Love?" she mused. "What do you mean by love?" And then, as if she could see the pain in my face, she came close and put her hands on my cheek. She was cold, unsatisfied, as I was cold and unsatisfied, teased by that mortal boy, but unsatisfied. "That you take my love for granted always," I said to her, "that we are wed." But even as I said these words, I felt my old conviction waver. I felt that torment I'd felt last night when she had taunted me about mortal passion. I turned away from her. "You would leave me for Armand if he beckoned to you." "Never," I said to her. "You would leave me, and he wants you as you want him." "He's been waiting for you." "Never." I rose now and made my way to that chest. The doors were locked, but they would not keep those vampires out. Only we could keep them out by rising as early as the light would let us. I turned to her and told her to come, and she was at my side. I wanted to bury my face in her hair. I wanted to beg her forgiveness, because in truth she was right, and yet I loved her as always. And now as I drew her in close to me, she said, "Do you know what it was that he told me over and over without ever speaking a word? Do you know what was the kernel of the trance he put me in, so my eyes could look only at him, so that he pulled me as if my heart were on a string?" "So you felt it," I whispered. "So it was the same." "He rendered me powerless," she said. I saw the image of her against those books above his desk, her limp neck, her dead hands. "But what are you saying? That he spoke to you? That he—" "Without words," she repeated. I could see the gas lights going dim, the candle flames too solid in their stillness. The rain beat on the panes. "Do you know what he said? That I should die," she whispered, "that I should let you go." I shook my head, and yet in my monstrous heart I felt a surge of excitement. She spoke the truth as she believed it. There was a film in her eyes, glassy and silver. "He draws life out of me into himself," she said, her lovely lips trembling so I couldn't bear it. I held her tight, but the tears stood in her eyes. "Life out of the boy who is his slave, life out of me whom he would make his slave. He loves you, he loves you, he would have you, and he would not have me stand in the way." "You don't understand him," I fought it, kissing her. I wanted to shower her with kisses, her cheek, her lips. "No, I understand him only too well," she whispered to my lips, even as they kissed her. "It is you who don't understand him. Love's blinded you, your fascination with his knowledge, his power. If you knew how he drinks death, you'd hate him more than you ever hated Lestat. Louis, you must never return to him, I tell you. I'm in danger." Early the next night I left her, convinced that Armand alone among the vampires of the theatre could be trusted. She let me go reluctantly, and I was troubled deeply by the expression in her eyes. Weakness was unknown to her, and yet I saw fear and something beaten even now as she let me go. And I hurried on my mission, waiting outside the theatre until the last of the patrons had gone, and the doormen were tending to the locks. What they thought I wasn't certain, an actor like the others who did not take off his paint. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they let me through and I passed them, and the few vampires in the ballroom unaccosted, to stand at last at Armand's open door. He saw me immediately, no doubt, had heard my step a long way off, and he welcomed me at once, and asked me to sit down. He was busy with his human boy, who was dining at the desk on a silver plate of meats and fish. A decanter of white wine stood next to him, and though he was feverish and weak from last night, his skin was florid, and his heat and fragrance were a torment to me. Not apparently to Armand, who sat in the leather chair by the fire opposite me, turned to the human, his arms folded on the leather arm. The boy filled his glass and held it up, now in a salute. "My master," he said, his eyes flashing on me as he smiled, but the toast was to Armand. "Your slave," Armand whispered with a deep intake of breath that was passionate, and he watched as the boy drank deeply. I could see him savoring the wet lips, the mobile flesh of the throat, as the wine went down, and now the boy took a morsel of white meat, making that same salute, and consumed it slowly, his eyes fixed on Armand. It was as though Armand feasted upon the feast, drinking in that part of life which he could not share any longer except with his eyes. And lost though he seemed to it, it was calculated. Not that torture I'd felt years ago when I stood outside Babette's window, longing for her human life. When the boy had finished, he knelt his arms around Armand's neck as if he actually savored the icy flesh. And I could remember the night Lestat first came to me, how his eyes seemed to burn, how his white face gleamed. "You know what I am to you now." Finally it was finished. He was to sleep, and Armand locked the brass gates against him, and in minutes, heavy with his meal, he was dozing. And Armand sat opposite me, his large, beautiful eyes tranquil and seemingly innocent. When I felt them pull me towards him, I dropped my eyes, wished for a fire in the grate, but there were only ashes. "You told me to say nothing of my origin. Why was this?" I asked, looking up at him. It was as if he could sense my holding back, yet wasn't offended, only regarding me with a slight wonder. But I was weak too, weak for his wonder, and again I looked away from him. "Did you kill this vampire who made you? Is that why you are here without him? Why you won't say his name? Santiago thinks that you did. And if this is true, or if we can't convince you otherwise, you would try to destroy us?" I asked. "I would not try to do anything to you," he said calmly, "but as I told you, I'm not the leader here in the sense that you asked." "Yet they believe you to be the leader, don't they? And Santiago, you shoved him away from me twice." "I'm more powerful than Santiago, older." "Santiago is younger than you are," he said. His voice was simple, devoid of pride. These were facts. "We want no quarrel with you. It's begun," he said, "but not with me, with those above." "But what reason has he to suspect us?" He seemed to be thinking now, his eyes cast down, his chin resting on his closed fist. After a while which seemed interminable, he looked up. "I could give you reasons," he said, "that you are too silent, that the vampires of the world are a small number and live in terror of strife amongst themselves and choose their fledglings with great care, making certain that they respect the other vampires mightily. There are 15 vampires in this house, and the number is jealously guarded, and weak vampires are feared. I should say this also, that you are flawed is obvious to them. You feel too much. You think too much. As you said yourself, vampire detachment is not of great value to you. And then there is this mysterious child, a child who can never grow, never be self-sufficient. I would not make a vampire of that boy there now if his life, which is so precious to me, were in serious danger. Because he is too young, his limbs not strong enough, his mortal cup barely tasted. Yet you bring with you this child." "What manner of vampire made her?" they ask. "Did you make her? So you see, you bring with you these flaws and this mystery, and yet you are completely silent. And so you cannot be trusted." And Santiago looks for an excuse, but there is another reason closer to the truth than all those things which I've just said to you, and that is simply this, that when you first encountered Santiago in the Latin Quarter, you, unfortunately, called him a buffoon. Ah! I sat back. "It would perhaps have been better all around if you had said nothing." And he smiled to see that I understood with him the irony of this. I sat reflecting upon what he'd said, and what weighed as heavily upon me through all of it were Claudia's strange admonitions, that this gentle-eyed young man had said to her, "Die," and beyond that my slowly accumulating disgust with the vampires in the ballroom above. I felt an overwhelming desire to speak to him of these things, of her fear. No, not yet, though I couldn't believe when I looked into his eyes that he tried to wield this power over her. His eyes said, "Live." His eyes said, "Learn." And oh, how much I wanted to confide to him the breadth of what I didn't understand. How searching all these years I'd been astonished to discover those vampires above had made of immortality a club of fads and cheap conformity. And yet through this sadness, this confusion, came the clear realization. Why should it be otherwise? What had I expected? What right had I to be so bitterly disappointed in Lestat that I would let him die, because he wouldn't show me what I must find in myself? Armand's words, what had they been? The only power that exists is inside ourselves. Listen to me, he said now. You must stay away from them. Your face hides nothing. You would yield to me now were I to question you. Look into my eyes. I didn't do this. I fined my eyes firmly on one of those small paintings above his desk until it ceased to be the Madonna and Child and became a harmony of line and color. Because I knew what he was saying to me was true. Stop them if you will. Advise them that we don't mean any harm. Why can't you do this? You say yourself we're not your enemies, no matter what we've done. I could hear him sigh faintly. I have stopped them for the time being, he said, but I don't want such power over them as would be necessary to stop them entirely, because if I exercise such power, then I must protect it. I will make enemies, and I would have forever to deal with my enemies, when all I want here, as a certain space, a certain peace, or not to be here at all. I accept the scepter of sorts they've given me, but not to rule over them, only to keep them at a distance.